So where do we start? I hope you're all puzzled, tantalized as to what might be following. And don't worry, we have about 10 topics, 10 words that we can put on our new horizons. But what I thought I'd do is just invite each of our speakers to speak for 3 or 4 minutes at most, under 4 headings. And then we have some other headings. If you accept those, we can move on, or we can discuss them more fully. So the first 4 headings are, first of all, from Nick. We've got a simple statement about make history. From Lee, a simple statement about take responsibility. From Ivan, a statement which I can already sense will cause an allergic reaction in part of the audience, which is question transparency. And then Brett will have a early provocation, which sounds very demanding, about empower all groups. And so I now hand over to our 4 provocateurs to talk for a few minutes on those 4 initial provocations. Nick, on making history.
Okay, Robert, thank you very much indeed. Making history, to me, is quite intriguing. I think if I go and see the rector at the Royal College of Art, which is where I work, and explain to him tomorrow where I've been today, he'll say, Nick, you made history. I don't think we've ever had anybody go to the World Congress of Accountants from the Royal College of Art before, let alone be asked to address the group. But to me, one of the things about the Royal College of Art, 175 years old, is that it's had some provocateurs over the years. It's made history. But we are not made by our history. Our role is to make history. And that is something I also reflect on for yourselves. Are you made by your history? And clearly, there is a tremendous history of this profession. Or are you in the business now of going forward and making history? Really reflecting on the change that's necessary going forward. Are you responding to change in regulation? Are you responding to where regulation has failed? Is that response mode the way that the profession should work? Or is it one of leadership, of being proactive in the nature of the changes? Because right now we are going through a period of dramatic change. I am a teacher. I teach people about design. I teach people about innovation at Imperial College in London and the Royal College of Art. And my profession has changed. The medical profession has changed. The engineering profession has changed. And many are saying all these changes are because of this kind of tide of technology that's coming at us. But I would say to you, the tide of technology is merely a sideshow. That tide of technological change is enabling some things that are happening which your profession must respond to, just like others. Globalization. Empowered citizens that recognize the importance of not just representative democracies, but participative ones. Social media that's changing the nature of whose voice can make a sustainable impact. All these are having dramatic changes on the way businesses work, on those who lead businesses, and even which businesses we will engage with. And what impact will they have on your profession? That's something that during the course of this session, I really look forward to exploring. So that's my little bit about making history.
That's great, and it was well within time, so you've set a great precedent there. Very good. So I could now turn to Lee, who can't have any of the time that Nick didn't use, but do give us some thoughts on taking responsibility.
So I think picking up on what Nick said, many of these trends and these changes are impacting how we think about business and how business is conducted, primarily how businesses are organized. Business is an amazing power for change, both good and bad, potentially. But at its heart is the challenge of how you organize people and their labor and their creativity to create value. And what's interesting from a historical perspective is that most of the sort of American and European corporate model is locked into a very, very old structural model. So the sort of corporate structure, cascading hierarchy, departments, budget meetings, project managers, and all of this sort of high-cost way of doing business is fundamentally an invention of the late 19th century, updated with Fordism and Taylorism in the early part of the 20th, and solidified by enterprise technology, enterprise IT, the role of IBM and so on from the mid-20th century onwards. And A, it hasn't changed, and B, it's not really fit for purpose in the 21st century. But nor is it the only model we have. If we look back through history, there are various other models that are much more networked, much more based on networks of high-trust relationships between groups of individuals, whether we're talking about the Hansestadt in Northern Europe, or we're talking about Hawala and informal money transfers in Africa and Asia. We have other archetypes, we have other templates that we can use. And what's really interesting is that thanks to the technology, collaboration technology, social technology, and so on, it's never been easier to operate businesses using these, what you might call alternative structures and alternative models. If you look to the world of high-value creating startups around the world, what you'll find is that they have none of these characteristics. Their first impulse is not to hire a CFO or a head of sales or a head of HR or to create a solid departmental structure and a bureaucracy. What they do is they operate in small teams of highly motivated, purpose-driven individuals who work in a sort of cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary way. And this is probably the most highly productive structure that we're seeing in the market today. And if this indicates a direction of travel for mainstream business, then obviously that has impacts on accountancy as well. And I think the impacts that I'm interested in are how do we go from an emphasis on process and, let's say, post-facto regulation, where process is always what you might call a response to prior stupidity. In other words, something goes wrong, let's create another process to make sure it doesn't happen again, and then lo and behold, it happens again. How can we go from that to a situation where we hire the right people, we give them the right values and a sense of purpose, and we join them together in a way that they can take responsibility, both as individuals and as a group, for the way that business is conducted successfully, and also for some of the accounting standards, the ethical values, and the sense of wider purpose that people are demanding business demonstrate in society today. So I think just as business is changing quite fundamentally in the 21st century, getting better, getting cheaper, getting much easier to scale and to grow on a global basis, so too we will see some of those changes reflected in the profession as well. And that's a really interesting challenge to start with.
Thank you. So 2 challenges so far, making history and taking responsibility. I now turn to Ivan to maybe question transparency.
First, I should start with confession that I'm a total outsider to your world. It was just on 2 occasions that I have basically faced the accountancy problem. 25 years ago, I have been dating an accountant. And after she basically audited me thoroughly, she married somebody else. And the second is, in this my book, In Mistrust We Trust, I was trying to see that there are 2 ways to cover information. One is by not telling anything, and the other is by giving too much information. And then I said, if you don't trust me, ask your accountant. And I do believe that my major point, and that's a simple point, is the following. We are living in a period in which the level of mistrust towards institutions, both government and corporate institutions, is very high. Of course, there is a paradox, because if you read public opinion polls, people don't trust anybody. If you see how much they're basically trading on net, obviously there is a certain type of trust when you're all the time in exchange with people that you don't know. But the story is that there is a very strong pressure and belief that transparency by itself can create trust in society. And the question which I want to put to you is the following. I do believe that transparency is something very important. If you see disclosure of information on food, on medicine, and so on, make people much more powerful as the customers. But I'm afraid that we're reaching a point in which transparency is not treated as an instrument for better functioning, quote, but as an objective in itself. And I don't believe it's enough something to be more transparent. Transparency should work for some different public interest. And if there are going to be new and new regulations, pushing businesses to do more and more, believing that you're going, and this is very important for your professions, that you're going to make the corporate sector totally transparent for somebody who does not make any sense of business, I do believe that this is an illusion and this can backfire. So my question and my appeal is really question transparency, because at a certain point of view, we have these tendencies to make objectives out of instruments.
Thank you. I sense there might already be some desire to react, but just hang on a little bit. We'll allow you shortly to do that when we have Brett with
Thank you.
some thinking behind the phrase empower all groups.
All right. I'm actually going to throw two quick provocations at. I don't know if the first one's actually a provocation, but I thought we were just reflecting on the notion of horizons. I'm actually from South Africa. There's actually quite a few South Africans in the conference, I've noticed. But I used to actually, for a while, live in a town on the coast of South Africa called Coffee Bay. So it's a tiny little rural town. And one thing I always noticed about Coffee Bay was that you could see the horizon. There was an epic horizon there. And the important thing about that wasn't so much, I mean, in one sense, we always interpret horizons as this idea of looking forward. But horizons have a very important role in contextualizing where you actually are. So, for example, I moved from Coffee Bay to London, and in London, you never, ever see the horizon. Basically, you see maximum 20 meters in front of you at any one point in London. And in London, you get very, very good at very particular technical things. You become an expert, you master stuff, you get very, very good at stuff, but you lose a sense of what your actual context is. So I guess maybe just to put this in, horizons can be something to center yourself and see where you want to get to. And in terms of my designated task of, I guess, putting this question out about empowering people, one of the reasons I suspect I got invited here was I actually wrote an article in Economia, which is the ICAEW magazine, called Accountants as Anarchists. Which was actually a very popular article, so go look it up on Google if you want to check it out. I think it got a lot of tweets, which is a sign of success apparently. But the interesting thing, I try to clarify what I mean in the article. It sounds quite contentious, but in public discourse, the notion of an anarchist is always a sort of a slightly disruptive, chaotic individual. But in original anarchist philosophy and the actual political philosophy, the idea is how do you create self-organizing systems that don't rely on explicit hierarchies of power. And that was the kind of the idea of and then, in practice it's hard to achieve. And in the article I was trying to argue that accountants have a very important role if you're ever trying to creating self-organizing systems in society that don't lead to power concentrations. So trying to keep everyone accountable. And so I guess that was my initial entry into this. And actually, I used to work in the financial sector in derivatives, over-the-counter derivatives. So I actually have quite a few friends who used to say work in accounting. And I always used to be at parties with my friends. And if you say you met a new accountant at a party and you say, hey, well, what do you do? And they're like, oh, I'm just an accountant. I'm just, don't mind me. I know what I do is boring and stuff. And I used to be like, no, that's the wrong attitude. There's a very important role you can serve in society about actually empowering people, and this notion that you're just an accountant is not a very positive one. So I guess that article is about challenging that. We can go into that.
Thank you. Well, they've all done very well in keeping to time. I will just ask again if maybe we could put the lights up generally, but I'm not sure I've got any power to make this happen.
This is the problem with transparency.
Yes. We're very transparent. You're all opaque, and I think... Yeah. Could we turn the lights up in the room as a whole? Is there anyone back there? Is there anyone in the back row who could actually speak to somebody who's near some knobs that they could twiddle?
Won't make the obvious joke.
And earlier on, we did have light in the room as a whole. Okay. Anyway, in the meantime, whilst the search for the light switch goes on, maybe I could just allow a bit of reflection amongst the panelists on what they said. And I just have as a side issue here that we've learned fascinating things about some of the private lives and histories of the individuals. Ivan's given us his love rejections of his life. We know where Brett grew up and his attitude at parties, which is seeking out all the accountants. And I'm looking to see any insights that will come from this side. It's kind of quite interesting. These are the two Brits who actually didn't give quite as much away as about their lives.
Always.
Yeah, very discreet. Maybe, Brett, could I just follow up a little bit more on that empowering groups which we had in this little slogan? Do you feel that actually there's a broader range of interests, or is there a presumption there that the accounting professions sort of got aligned with the corporate sector? And maybe that also ties into Lee talking about our model of how business is conducted through corporates and how we see, shareholders and so on. I'd just like to explore that a bit more because it underpins the way we think about accounting and who the audience is. So either of you, if you want to have a go at that.
Well, maybe I should say, I suppose there's a difference between, I've experienced this when I work in the financial sector. There's a difference between the day-to-day practice and how you think about yourself versus how the public perceives you. So certainly with groups, so in some ways I want to talk about maybe perhaps how the public perceives the industry rather than how on a day-to-day basis it feels like. But certainly with a lot of, I work with quite a few NGOs and quite a few civil society groups, and definitely there's a perception in civil society groups, rightly or wrongly, that the accountancy profession is too tied up with the corporate sector. And I think this is not profound news to anybody. This is fairly well known. You see it in the aesthetics of accounting. You see it in the language that's used. It's very similar to the standard sort of aesthetics of business. So I guess one of the questions that going forward for the accounting profession is how do you change that image? Not necessarily to reject the corporate involvement, but how do you sort of show other groups in society that you're also representing their interests? And I guess part of this goes into what is the notion of the public interest that is actually presented. When I read a lot of accounting material, there's always this concept of the public interest. And in reality, when you actually study accounting documents, the public interest is often seen to be seen as the same thing as investor interest, a particular part of the public. And it doesn't necessarily start from the perspective of, say, employees or the general public who's actually buying products. What part of the public? So I guess if you're looking for the future horizon of how do you create a holistic accounting profession, we've got to be thinking about how do you create, for example, a form of employee auditing, where there's some employees are involved in the process and the public's involved in auditing as well. So we can discuss those in particular.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Picking up on that briefly, I think I would disagree slightly in that I don't think it's about investor interest necessarily. I think in most cases where business goes wrong, actually it's senior management who have managed to sort of capture the machinery of the company and don't necessarily act in the interests of investors or employees or the public. And if you look at most of the well-known accounting sort of scandals, that's what's happened, along with a degree of regulatory capture, which is obviously a very serious sort of social phenomenon that no amount of additional process can regulate for in that sector. But I think what's interesting is, the way we see companies is changing. The external boundaries of a company are not necessarily as clear as they were, 30, 40 years ago. Everything is sort of network-based and network-driven to the extent that we're seeing some companies that have such close relationships with B2B supply chains or partners or external bodies in their markets that actually there's a sort of permeable membrane between the inside and the outside. And I'm personally very excited by that because I think networks are, without doubt, our sort of 21st century superpower. And humans connected together with a sense of common purpose in a network are capable of anything, such as, obviously in the South African liberation struggle. You can see how informal structures, informal organizations can achieve something that many of us thought was close to impossible without violence. So, if you look at businesses from the point of view of networks, you can consider the health of their networks, both internally and externally, and that's when this question of their relationship with the public starts to come in. Like Ivan, I'm not convinced that everything the public says is always correct, nor that they have perfect information or fully understand the business. But when you can engage from the inside out and from the outside in, what you do is you generate a level of protection for that business, because you create enough connections that if something's going wrong, enough people know about that, and they can suggest remedies or ways to avoid an absolute catastrophe. So I think looking at businesses from the point of view of networks, both how they function internally and how they engage with their societies at large, is probably the key to that challenge.
Thank you. And Ivan, just a minute. Notice in there that we've already picked up a couple of other themes that we'd thought of introducing later on about building networks, which is really at the core of the history of the profession, is about being a network, and also claiming the public interest rather than taking the public interest. Ivan, you wanted to interject?
I also wanted to jump, because I do believe, in a way, as a profession, you're facing a problem which the lawyers know very well. They believe that they're in the business to decide what is legal, but people to believe that they're in the business to decide what is just. And I'm just going to give you an example. Just 5 days ago, the fourth biggest Bulgarian bank bankrupted. It was audited 4 months ago by one of the big multinational auditing companies. It said everything is fine. And everybody knew that it is not fine, because this bank, for the last 3 years, has declaring twice higher interest rates than any other, and declared much lower bad loans than anybody else. So in a certain way, everybody knew that it was wrong, but probably their documents were right. And this is the thing that it's very difficult to explain to the public. And this is why I do believe that the problem with the transparency is twofold. On one level, everything that people don't understand, they do believe is corruption. But on the other side, I do believe all this idea of transparency creates the illusion that it is enough for people to go through certain documents and they're going to understand how certain business works or what has happened. And I'm very much afraid that we're in the business of very much criminalizing many things. The culture of suspicion is very strong. And at least my position is that the problem of accountants as a community, not as a single company or accountant, is that facing this dilemma, the only way for you to survive is going to be very much to be critical about your own. I'm, for example, interested to see how the Bulgarian accountancy community is going to look at the fact that the bank has been audited, it was declared great, Bulgarian central bank said it's great, and 4 months later it appeared that 4 billions are not there. And this is the problem that, in my view, is how you're taking place in defining public interests, because all the talk about standards and documents and technicalities, people don't understand this.
Mm-hmm. Right, you're on notice now that I can now see the audience out there in their entirety, so I can see who might, well, maybe putting your hand up's a bit much, so maybe you just have to stand up if you want to speak. And I think there might be some people with microphone. There might be a microphone? I think there's a microphone. But Nick, do you want to add anything whilst people decide who wants to stand up and comment on what we've heard so far?
I would very much, just picking up Ivan's point just now about regulation. Is the rise of regulation an inevitable response to failure? Does it mean that as we increase the level of regulation, we end up outsourcing our moral compass as to what is just to the regulator? Because if we can work within regulation, then it must be okay. Interesting. Because that leads us on to not just about the creation of value, but also our values. Now, I used to have values that were, when I was young, that were not well informed, I should add. And I know all of you have values as well. Values that perhaps brought you into this profession. But are we able to easily exercise those values? Are we able to keep them on the front burner, giving the case of the Bulgarian bank just now, when we're also in a culture of compliance, where we have engineered processes to a point where we've perhaps focused far more on the compliance and the engineering of those processes than how empathic they are with the needs of the people they were set up to serve. And that kind of leads me then into this space about who are we serving? The public interest? Are we serving the client? Who bought the services? Who paid for the audit? Are we looking after the stakeholders? Now, as a designer, the way we work as designers is we see the world through the lens of human experience. We try and be empathetic with all of the people that we are trying to serve. The customers, the employees, the communities. Are we still able to do that in a highly regulated world where we've created a web of regulation which has effectively become a rule book for us to lean back on and stay calm? I saw a badge earlier, stay calm, from the Nigerian contingent on the front. Welcome to Nigeria, I feel. Very good, you. But keep calm, keep accounting, but I would say, and keep close to your moral compass here, because I think there's some magnetic interference.
Good, and that point you make about the reasons why people come into the profession and that those reasons and those values survive is something which is very much at the heart of Audit Futures, of trying to engage students and young people in the profession to keep those values alive. So I'm now looking for someone who might be wishing to contribute. Excellent. Sir, stand up.
And
tell us who you are and see if somebody will give you a microphone. Do you want me to repeat it through the microphone? Have you got a mic? Here it comes. Relief in the form of a microphone. Do you want to go back to the start? I heard it, but maybe...
I'm Anwaruddin Chowdhury from the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Bangladesh. I reckon accountants are making history every moment through value addition in a fair and transparent manner with necessary empowerment by having the relevant degree of vision, leadership, innovation, and ensuring due sustainability of the products and services that we are offering to those we serve, i.e. our clients. There's just one point that I'd like to very respectfully disagree with Ivan here, and sort of add on to our historian, that both over-regulation and under-regulation are bad. The right balance must be struck by the regulator. We must not over-regulate to bring about a retardation or stagnation in the process of business development. At the same time, the regulators should be conscious enough to ensure that they are diligent in exercising their regulatory powers to avoid the situations like similar to what Ivan has pointed out. I'd have thought the central bank or the Financial Service Authority should have been alert to classify it as a problem bank and bring it under their surveillance.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good points, but don't go on too long or else I'll forget what you've said to play it back to the panel. I think there's a couple of good challenges there. First of all, I think there was a stout defence from a chartered accountant with some values that actually thinks that what we've been challenging people to do, which is to make history, is actually something which some people think they're doing all the time, and maybe we need to recognise the particular role of the profession in emerging economies, transition economies, where actually there probably is a feeling of making history. And also I think a useful challenge there about, well, it's not kind of regulation bad, lack of regulation good. How can we articulate what the balance is? Because I think that's probably the more difficult balance, difficult challenge to respond to. So I'd welcome any of those, either of those issues being picked up. I'm a little bit worried about being taken down a rabbit hole of a particular Bulgarian bank, because we've actually spent probably the past 6 years in the profession wondering internationally about bank audits and what we need to do. But if I can give you those two challenges.
I mean, I think very briefly to your point on under-regulation and over-regulation, obviously you're correct. Neither of those two extremes are the right answer. But I think the question is how. I think it's how you regulate. And I think the old way of assuming that you just write some rules and you invent some processes and then you sort of enforce compliance with those, I think that's actually a very blunt instrument, and I don't think it's very effective, and I think we have better alternatives. I think the first alternative is education. If we inculcate moral, ethical, and professional standards to a higher degree, and we rely on individuals to behave in a way that's connected with other individuals. So there is an argument in favor of some transparency there. We have these ideas of big data, we have these ideas of sort of, monitoring and surveillance and so on. So actually, if you are doing something wrong, then, that should be exposed and be clear to your colleagues much earlier on in the process. I think that's a self-regulating mechanism that we're not doing enough with. But also, I just don't think more processes and more process-driven regulation is going to do the job. I think that's the challenge, is to find smarter, more imaginative ways of ensuring the right behavior and not the wrong behaviors.
Okay. Anyone else want to respond? Ivan?
Yeah. I take your point, and I agree, but here the problem is the following. I'm a political scientist. What the politician do when there is a major crisis? Decides to do something that is very radical, and this is change in legislation. Go with a new regulation. Do anybody believe that regulation exists which by its own is going to make bankruptcy impossible? No, because it's also implementation, it's also about how people act and react to certain things. And I do believe that here you as a community know very much which information is useful and which is not. Because in order to show and also to punish in a certain way, the financial community, the idea is we're going to make these people give us more and more information because this is how a politician defends himself in front of the public. But if you're going to have a bank which 60% of its time is spending on being transparent when they're spending time on doing their own work, in my view, this is part of the problem. And this is, in a certain way, you being very much professionals in this business should talk about how the regulation should look like and not simply basically to take the regulation in the way it's going to come from politicians, because politicians have a different clients in a way. And these clients are not interested in business. They're much more interested to be convinced that the magic of non-bankruptcy is going to come. And here Bulgaria is a good example. 12 years ago, we have a major banking crisis with 11 banks bankrupted. And we have one of the best banking legislation as a result of it. Does it prevent this banking crisis from happening?
Anyone else like to react to our input there from Bangladesh?
Maybe I'll put my activist hat on, just to be a bit different. I noticed, this is maybe just a more general comment. One thing you said was those we serve, and then you said our clients. And it's quite interesting, you find this mentality a lot in professions. The idea that the objective of the profession is to serve the client. And I know people have a more nuanced understanding of that, so I'm sort of essentializing it a bit. But it's quite a problematic thing, because in a way, there's a difference between mastering a profession and serving a client and serving the public interest. They can align with each other, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So let me give you an example I've been experiencing the last few days. I've been staying in this slightly ridiculously fancy hotel because I'm one of the speakers, and they put me in this hotel. And I noticed there's a lot of like kind of butler-type individuals and people who serve you. Now, I imagine in the context of that hotel, the people there think of themselves as we are serving our clients in this hotel. All right, there's a certain attitude, and maybe within that, you can have different ideas about, okay, maybe I take more personal responsibility, I have more flexibility in doing it, maybe I do it, maybe I follow the rules really strictly. Actually, a very strange thing this morning where I walked into my room, and the person was busy cleaning my room, and they just carried on cleaning as if I hadn't walked in. So it was a very process-driven situation. They weren't responding empathetically to who I was, the fact that I was in the room. But they've been told, you have to do this. So in a way, it's kind of a regulatory structure. And so that's kind of the debate you have within an industry. But there's a separate question entirely, which is, do you think about the people outside the hotel as the person who's working in there? I mean, who is the person in the five-star hotel? And I guess this is a fundamentally different perspective to start off from when you're thinking about what the public interest is. And I think if you have sort of the activist hat, always is starting from outside the hotel and then thinking about the inside. Whereas I suppose a lot of times, I mean, I'm not saying this is always the case, but a lot of times the profession that starts inside the hotel and then there's a sort of an afterthought about, okay, well, how do we also include the outside of the hotel as well? I don't know that analogy made entire sense.
No, I think it was very good, actually. Very. Nick, anything to add, or shall we?
I think let's go to another question.
Is there somebody else who would like to ask? I can see a hand there, and we might be able to get the microphone to unite with the hand. And like the previous gentleman, if you could tell us who you are, that would be great.
Graham Gordon, Praxity Chief Executive. Given the extreme pressure on audit fees from users and from less extent from larger accounting firms fishing down the food chain, so to speak, and given the need to maintain quality and therefore human intervention, what would the panel suggest as outsiders on how to square this particular circle in the public interest?
That's a good question. Let me kind of play it back in a different way, which might just be, that's a great aspiration, but if you're actually, Graham's chief executive of a practicing firm, and the world you're operating in is one in which there's fee pressure and there's huge regulatory requirements, what do you do? Is it something you can act on individually, or what do we actually look to do to address this higher interest? And I might even say that it could be a challenge for what do you do if you're actually a hotel worker, or even you're in a hotel
Can we
chain.
clarify
Anyway,
what the
practical responses would be
specific
great.
meaning of fee pressure is in the context of, because I'm not
Want
in a
to pay
day.
less.
Sorry?
People want to pay less.
Yes, I mean, it's just
Well,
good business practice.
maybe I can
Nick.
just come in on that. Just explaining a little bit more about what I do at the Royal College of Art. My department doesn't design stuff. It designs services. In fact, it goes beyond designing services. We design experiences. So if you walk into, let's say, an Apple store, you know that is a different experience than walking into your local electronics shop normally, because it was designed. And we're doing things working with the UK's top retailers, we're working with governments on public services, we're working on healthcare. We are in the business of trying to help organizations transform the quality of service that they deliver by design, not by chance. Now, part of that process is to really ensure that we focus single-mindedly on what is the ultimate user experience that needs to be fulfilled, and then figure out what are the processes, the people, the organization that allows that to happen. Now, I also know from all the work, I spent many years in industry and business doing stuff, business stuff. And I do know that from the world of business to business, that the only way you can sell services to a business is to find out how they create value for their customer, how they capture that value, and help them create more of it. Now, that's where I think, coming back to the particular question that we've got here, how does your client create value for its customers? And if in creating value for its customers and capturing that value, how do you create more for it? Means that you also have to look at the broader context of the environment that it's operating in. And then you have to use design, in the traditional way of using design, to design that kind of richer service experience that can manage to deliver all the little touch points of how you engage with the client in a much, much more effective way. And that effective way can be both cost-effective as well as creating more value. But now let's pick up that element of values that you described a moment ago. And it's one of the things which we've been, and I raised as well. How do you deliver value and live with a set of values? Well, I think there are 4 crucial ingredients to be able to do that. The first is that everybody in your organization that engages with the client has to look beyond the process itself to understand how they are delivering value for the client. They have to have an opportunity to go beyond that process, not just be compliant with it, so that they can create some unique value of their own. They need to feel valued by the management that is leading that engagement and by the client. And then the final element is that their values and the values of the organization and its customers that it's serving have to be aligned. Now, if any one of those elements is missing, then the service is going to be compliant, but I would say it fails to create that combination of value and values. And all those four ingredients, I think, have to be present.
Well, that's quite a challenging thing to follow. I think I kept up. I was writing it down, but I just wonder whether there's, I mean, maybe that's a way of reconciling what Brett had been saying with about a broader public interest and serving clients. I just welcome other thoughts on this, because it's probably quite a crucial issue for this profession, that it does have clients or employers with their expectations, and then this public interest aspiration, and reconciling those. You've suggested a way of reconciling them, but I'd welcome reactions from other
I'd say
speakers on that.
really briefly, it's a real tough nut to crack, because audits demand the hard work of a lot of young people running around with spreadsheets for an intensive period of time, and then other people further up the food chain to sort of verify that information and to check it and go over it and so on.
So you've been audited. I can tell you've seen them running around with spreadsheets.
Occasionally I would go into my office and say, why is it full of 12-year-old children wearing coloured socks? And it would be explained to me that we were having an audit. So that's how I came to understand.
That diversity disappears after a while. They turn into black socks.
Yeah.
That's great.
When you get more senior.
In fact,
maybe
it's quite
Brett,
revealing.
there's a second career. Obviously, audit's necessary. It's time-consuming. It costs money, and yes, increasingly, clients, don't want to pay for that money. I would say something in favour of service design. I think that does give us a way of thinking about the audit process and how it can be streamlined or improved, etc. And I would say also just a brief word in favour of sort of, how would you say, always-on technology, rather than the intensive application of spreadsheets for a limited period of time. Actually, perhaps giving the client organization some systems which sort of gather a lot of the hard work themselves throughout the year, and then you can focus on the sort of verification and the validation, rather than have to do some of the grunt work that I know still takes place sometimes. But I'm going to be honest and say, for all of our nice words sitting up here, that's a straightforward business challenge, which is not an easy one to fix with nice ideas. Fee pressure on the one hand, complexity of audit on the other hand, lots of new technology to take on board as well. So it's a tough one, but I think there are, service design plus technology gives some hope of improving the process, but that's about as far as I can go.
Let me just turn it back to this side. Ivan and Brett. Ivan was being very politely gesturing to me.
I just basically wanted to make one point. Seen from outside, there is something similar between lawyers and auditors, but in my view, they should be totally different. Because lawyer, is defending a client. And from this point of view, if you're going to defend somebody who is really a tough client from the point of view of a public interest, it can probably bring your reputation. But auditing is about early warning. And if it appears that your client is a bad client, it should be your reputation problem. And I do believe it's quite important when you see some of these companies that are bankrupted or mismanagement and so on, you should know who audited them. And this should be made a reputation cost to be paid. And I do believe this is interesting because, of course, most of these companies are the companies that pay highest for being audited creatively. And my feeling is this is where the public problem with the auditing is. You don't see where the reputation cost is.
Thank you. Brett.
Graham, I'd be quite interested to know your perspectives on how you do it. I don't know, panel discussions, you always have people sort of putting out opinions, but I'm sure you got some of your own. Do you want to?
Okay. You're invited to the audience.
I'd quite like to know
again,
what you say.
Do I see a hand or a person going up? And I see one over there. If we can connect the microphone with the waving hand, that would be good. Do you want to stand up?
Stand up, yeah. I'm in a
Yes,
vessel
that'd be
anyway. Yeah, just a few points.
And you are?
Oh, sorry, yes, yeah. Lisa Bowyer, from the Cayman Islands. Worked in regulation compliance for a number of years. And yeah, so basically, regulation obviously should only be used where there's market failure, but it shouldn't prevent market failure. So I think there's some basic lessons we already know about what regulation should be or shouldn't be. But of course, I feel that having been in this area for quite a number of years, that maybe we're coming into a new era where we should be thinking about regulation more as a science, or abandoning it altogether and rethinking what we're doing and what we're trying to achieve. One other point is that people sometimes think they know what they want, but they're not always right, and they don't always act on what they think. So I think perception is a huge problem for the world, because as has been pointed out, we've got social media, we are empowered, but in some ways we're also disabled, because it's very difficult for people to assimilate that information. So when we talk about market failure and the need for regulation, all of a sudden I entirely agree with the point that I was making, that it doesn't necessarily help us fix that problem if we give more information. So that's a problem. But another aspect of that about what do people think they want, why do people choose a career in accounting? I don't know if it's because they want to protect the public interest. I certainly want to protect the public interest. I'm very passionate about that. So that's one thing, and you've got to define it, which isn't always easy. And then, does it sometimes conflict with acting in your client's interests? Yes, it does. And then what about your own interests? Because we're built on a model of capitalism, which requires us to take the rational man approach, which means we have to protect our own jobs. So it's very difficult to get change when people are going to want to protect their own jobs and careers, unless we all become activists and passionate about changing the world. I'm not sure we're being realistic.
There's, thank you for that. I mean, a very fulsome contribution, which I think shows that we're kind of striking some chords here. Maybe rather than address all the points you raised there, you used a few words which chime in with some other horizons that we've talked about. We've alluded to claiming the public interest, and I think that's a good thing to throw across the speakers here as to what it actually means to claim the public interest, and take your point that actually a lot of people going into the accounting profession actually did it because they thought this was something worthwhile in the public interest without necessarily having defined that. So let me just first of all throw that out as a question to people. I don't know, if Van, whether you have you'd like to elaborate a bit more on what you said earlier about what it would mean to somebody motivated to go into career accountancy to kind of claim the public interest, and at what levels do we do that?
So I do believe we all like to talk about public interest, but public interest is not something which is obvious. And in a certain way, this is something to be negotiated into the political process, because there are different views, there are different risks. And from this point of view, at least for me, part of the problem which I have with the position of the accounting professions, in the way I see it, I don't see many accountants' voices in this debate. You're going to see accountants in court, but not on television. Basically saying what is possible, what is not possible, exactly when you have this type of a crisis, and people from time to time has a totally wrong expectations of what can come out of regulations or how certain problem can be solved. And from this point of view, at least for me, professions, and this is true for all professions, had the obligation, exactly from the point of view of public interest, from time to take unpopular positions. Mm-hmm. Because there is a populist pressure. Normally, people talk in moral terms. Normally, people don't talk in terms of institutions, in terms of proceedings. They basically talk in moral terms. And this type of a moralization of any actions makes any mistakes to look like a crime. It makes any failings to look like a crime. And I do believe this is the voices of the professionals to say, first of all, not every bankruptcy is a crime, but there are bankruptcies that are criminal. There are things and that and this. And this type of a distinction, in my view, should come from voices who are within this type of understanding how the business functions. And for me, this is part of the role of the accountants, not as a company, but as a voice in this type of defining public interest, because otherwise we can end up with a very populist understanding of a public interest, which is going to be also a very distorted one.
Thank you. Very clear. Anyone? Nick,
Yes.
you'd like to chip in on this one?
Yeah, no, can I just reflect on what we mean by public interest? And can I just think of it in terms of what is the public actually interested in when we talk about public interest? What are our interests? I mean, we're all the public. You know, when we're not doing somebody's books, we're the public. And what are the things we're interested in? What are we interested in about the companies that we deal with? We're interested in issues about the environment. We're interested in issues about the food we eat and the stuff we buy. We want to know it's ethically sourced. We want to know the jobs that our kids are getting are with companies that are pretty good. We want to know that the companies we deal with are ethical, that they live up to the promises that they make and they contribute something back. You know, if I look at my students now, what's interesting as they graduate from, you know, one of the leading institutes of art and design, or the students that we teach at Imperial, and they graduate and go off, they're not rushing off to take the traditional jobs. They're finding the very, very best are really auditing, not the books, but they're auditing what are the companies about. Now, I think this creates an amazing opportunity for you, because I think in terms of accounting and auditing and being able to help us, the public, that's interested in whether the company is focused and lives up to its environmental objectives, or whether it's trying to just give us some greenwash, whether it really is sourcing its products and services effectively, or whether it's just getting them from a sweatshop, whether it's looking after its people the way it says and contributing to the communities that they're in, or whether that's just part of the PR role. I think that's creating another opportunity to account for much more than just that which is on the balance sheet and the profit and loss. And so much of the value of companies is embedded in all of those kinds of things that you might describe as more intangibles. Well, they might go beyond the chart of accounts today, but I think in the chart of accounts that the public's interested in, they're really quite at a high level. And that, to me, says that's a heck of a business opportunity for someone. And you have the tools, the methods, and the approach to go and make a good living from going and doing that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Because that's in the public interest.
Thank you. Brett, do you buy that, or do you, do you
I
have
was
a
actually
different take on it?
I was, I guess, one of the things I wanted to draw on was this idea of what do we actually mean by transparency? Because a lot of the sort of traditional way you think about it is like, you know, here's a bunch of information and it's accurate, true and fair, accurate information. But I actually can't make sense of it. Okay, actually, a lot of times when I read company accounts, it's like this, especially banks, you know. Here's a huge amount of information and it's accurate. Great. So what in a normal financial accounts that you have a huge amounts of turgid, accurate information and then some PR from the company executives. Of course, the average person in society looking at those annual report, it means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. So the real exciting thing for, if I was trying to create a new firm, was real transparency is actually about how do you make information understandable. It's not just about pushing information out. And I guess this is how you make information into a useful tool. So I, as a member of the public, for example, if I'm an investor, or if I'm a journalist, or whoever I am, want to be able to pick up a financial report and actually understand what the data means, not just know that the data is accurate. And that's quite a different change of tack. And I think accountants have always been discussing this. To what extent do you try to contextualize information and put yourself out in the land there and say, this information actually means this, even though it looks like this here. And that goes into this whole realm of you know, you might have a company exec saying a whole bunch of stuff, but are you guys prepared to go out and say, yes, I buy the idea that this company exec, what you're saying is actually true. And they actually are trying to protect the environment, they are trying to protect all these particular things that people are interested in terms of the public interest. I'd be excited to create a firm like that personally.
Great, sure. And you did very well to carry on while is that somebody's phone going off with the most exciting ringtone ever?
It's a private disco.
Is it really?
The public came in.
Can I throw one final example?
Yes, carry on.
I'm actually been working with a group called Open Oil in Berlin, and it's actually some journalists. And the main role of Open Oil, it says it's an open data company. The whole idea is to look at oil company accounts and actually be able to make sense of them. If you go to, for example, BP, there is lots of information, transparent information you can find about BP accounts, but nobody in the public understands it. So the actual job at Open Oil is like, let's take this data and make it understandable. Let's contextualize it. Let's think about how you actually present it. And in this realm, there's a lot of exciting stuff, like visualization technologies, all forms of, you can go into the social media and all kind of tech stuff. But that's a very exciting opportunity to look at.
Actually, that touches on something that I think accountants are very good at, which is working with lots of information and devising ways to present the most relevant or germane information in a way that can be managed and have actions coming from it. There is some hope that big data and some forms of transparency can lead to better outcomes in terms of the, let's say, social impact of companies, the so-called public interest, etc. But it's about stories, it's about interpretation, it's about what matters and what doesn't matter, what's relevant, what's not relevant. And so I think if we do get to the stage where we start accounting for not these meaningless corporate social responsibility documents where we say we planted a tree and all this kind of rubbish, but actually something meaningful in terms of, what are our external costs in the society in which we operate, or what's, real-time, real data that actually changes over time, then you may well find a role for accountants, and indeed for the audit profession, in applying some standards to the presentation of that information such that the public can better understand, what these things are about. I mean, I would go back to that basic idea that when companies are more connected socially in the countries, the environments, the societies in which they operate, they're less likely to do harm. I'm a big fan of some big old European industrial companies, who are based in a town, and everyone in that town knows them, and they respect people in that town, they provide employment. They would never dream of doing a sort of environmental disaster to that particular town because, that's literally their home, whereas some other companies, I don't know if the Luxembourg delegation's here, but some other companies have become so ephemeral and multinational that they can just move things around, whether it's costs, inputs, or taxes, etc., in a way that means they don't have a home. So having that location, whether it's physical, geographical, or whether it's just based on networks and being more connected with external stakeholders, is something that maybe can give us some way forward. We can't claim to know what the public interest is. There are many public interests. We should beware moralizing about that, I think, because that's a dangerous road to go down. History teaches us. But yeah, more data shared in a way that actually the accounting profession can help bring some rigor to and bring some meaning and interpretation to is potentially one of the ways forward for that, I would say.
Okay. I can see another. Oh, it's you again. Well. Have another go. And since we're on to seconds here, if anybody else would like to get in first.
So I don't want to hog the floor, sorry, but I just wanted to go back to the public interest because IFAC did issue a paper about a year or so ago defining the public interest. It was fantastic because it was more extensive than I would have expected it to be. And it was interesting, Nick's comments, all of the things he talked about when he was talking about public interest were actually social and environmental issues rather than economic or business kind of interests. My sort of take is that it's globalization that's making this more difficult because when we were all just operating in a national level, it was much easier to know what your public interest was because it was basically your national interest. And with globalization now, it's much more difficult to pinpoint that. So you're right, you might need to, it might be different in different contexts, but I think my suggestion is a general thing is, as has just been said, is non-harming. So yeah, like HISMA basically is a principle that we should perhaps be taking forward. That's non-harming, because you talked about adding value. So it's basically, are you harming or are you overall adding value? And that's something that can be crunched and spoken about. So, okay. And then one last comment.
Let's capture. And of course, everyone does have the opportunity to keep on the conversation. I'm just keen to make sure that we will have been capturing that, and we'll love to get your input subsequently. But let's just see if somebody else There's a hand way up there, and there's a hand down here, so we've got a nice long dash from up there down here after. And do tell us who you are, even though I know who you are.
The UK.
You're quite a large small practitioner.
Well, quite a large small practitioner from the UK. Our profession is so powerful, partly because it's a profession, partly because it uses professional judgment, and we have successfully taught people about ethics. But the world is changing, and technology now means that the way that we work is very different. And you can't learn ethics from emails, you can't learn ethics from the website. You used to learn it from watching other people grapple with conflicts of interest and having the moral courage to make the right decision. I just wondered how the panelists saw the way that culture change by reason of technology is going to change the way that people make those decisions in the future, and how it will change the networks of individuals who are not necessarily in charge of companies, but are working in companies. Okay, I'll take that, and then if we can move the microphone down here, then because we're getting towards the end of the time, we can add this input, and the panel can have more time to reflect. And if there's anyone else who'd just like to put up their hand as well, we've got a guy in the middle. We're trying to keep you fit here as you run around. Then we'll take the 3 bits of input here and respond. Sir?
Yes, I am Hafiz Yusuf from the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Pakistan.
Pakistan, excellent.
Yeah. So actually, there is a big perception issue, from the public angle, the perception is that the auditors, they are so smart and intelligent, and they are perhaps having a lamp of Aladdin, so they would be able to finding out everything, So auditors, they take the refuge in the scope limitation,
Sorry, I couldn't quite catch
the auditors at times take refuge in the scope limitation that we are there only to carry out audit under a certain framework or parameters, But the perception of the public is altogether different, So they feel that they are perhaps kind of investigator, and they would be carrying out everything, and they would be digging out every kind of fraud and everything. I would like to quote here an example. If you appoint 2 firms to carry out, one for investigation of the financial state of affair for a particular period and one for the audit, the result would be totally different. I have experienced those assignments by myself. When you are carrying out a due diligence assignment, you would be able to find out so much, But at the same time, if you are carrying out the external audit, the results are totally different. And we also have seen those examples in the case of scope limitation, where the auditors had certified, the going concern assumption in the case of Lehman Brothers, other investment banking, But end of the day, after 1 week's time of the report issuance, there was no going concern. So here I would like to quote the famous quote of the former Prime Minister of Dr. Mahathir Mohamad at the last World Congress of Accountants, when he said that hiring an auditor is just like hiring a judge, You are paying him the fee to basically give your verdict in his favor, So, you have to see that equation also, who is the appointing authority, and from that angle, the independence of it.
Great. And then there was a hand in the middle there. If we can get a microphone up there. It's great to see this exercise you're getting. Have you got a microphone yet? It's in the center. No, he's behind you. Oh, no, it's this guy first. Right. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Hristo Mavrudiev. I'm from Bulgaria.
Oh, right.
It's not a question. It's just a little remark to what Ivan said. I'm a small practitioner, but earlier I was in the management board of our institute, and I presented our profession in public oversight board. This remark what I want to mention is that Ivan must say that this bankruptcy of these banks is going, maybe there is some reason of accountant, maybe they are guilty, maybe auditors are guilty. It will be, in the future, it will be investigated. But the general reason of these bankruptcies is because the politics are involved in managing these banks. Maybe more of Bulgarian state entities, their money was put it in this bank. And after that, this management give the loans without any covering to other entities which are private entities. So the connection is very easy. The other reason is that this big auditing firm which audit this bank now audits maybe 95–99% of all other Bulgarian banks. Can you imagine there is a fair competitiveness between auditors to take this engagement about the banks? So politics really are very involved in our profession. So if we prevent involvement of the profession, involvement of the politics to our profession in the future, will be the better way to create our profession in the future.
Thank you. So just to remind us of the three observations, and you can choose which you want to focus on. We had, first of all, a question about in the modern world with the use of technology and so on, how are people actually going to imbibe ethics and the idea of judgment? How does that happen practically, that you pick it up if it's not something which you can sort of learn online? Then we ended up with a quotation from the Mahathir Mohamad, which was taking us back to the last World Congress. But I think there were some issues around, and maybe what we've been talking about earlier, about understanding of what auditors do and the difference between audit and being given an explicit engagement to go digging, and how do we explain those differences in what you can find with different scopes of work, especially where the scope of what you're supposed to be doing is set down in law and standards. And then finally, and it's great to see we've got a deepening Bulgarian theme, because the guy who's been planning the whole session is Martin Martinov, who's also Bulgarian. So this, apart from the fact that Bulgaria is taking over the discourse about professional accountancy, which is a great thing, it's not happening a moment too soon. There's a question about actually in this situation, and maybe it's about what Ivan was talking about being unpopular, but there's politics around with a lot of these big failures, and I don't think those of us who aren't too familiar with Bulgaria would say that that's different from any previous banking crisis, that actually there's a great interest from a political interest in saying, well, surely everyone can afford houses and their own homes, and you're not going to be the people who say they can't. So wherever it kind of starts, there's a political expectation about the environment in which auditors are operating, and how far does making yourself unpopular go. So there's plenty to go out there, guys, and there's a quarter of an hour left, so I'm sure there's enough in there to finish off the session. But Ivan, I can see you'd like to go first.
First of all, I very much want to agree with what my Bulgarian colleague said. This bank collapsed because it was a political project. But here is probably part of the expectation of the public. Who is going to protect the public? And from this point of view, the auditors, if they decided to play their role rightly, could be a counterpower. And could be a counterpower only if they decide to go public. Because this is, in my view, part of the moral dilemma in the profession. You have a client, you have a kind of a confidential relations. You know that from time to time, even if you see that the numbers fit, you know that also some of these numbers are empty. And this was the story that 60% of the public, of those that have been interested, knew that there is something wrong with the bank. At the same time, people were keeping their money in the bank because they see ministers and others keeping their money in the bank, and people know the major rule in politics. Where ministers keep their money, banks do not bankrupt. I'm saying this because I do believe here is part of the public expectations, because now people are asking, who is protecting us when it comes to our interest? And then goes the problem of perceptions. I have been doing on an empirical base study of the corruption perceptions and their nature. And this is a very interesting, of course, also quite troubling. The story is that many times the perception of how corrupt your country is not based on your experience, but on the basis of what you're reading about this. It appears that the most corrupt are the institutions that we know least about. People who, for example, never doing the customs office are more ready to believe that everything there is corruption than people who basically are dealing with it. And from this point of view, I do believe that this is also a part of an interesting dilemma for your profession. How close you want to be? how much you want to allow non-professionals to be part of your discussions and your debates. Because strangely enough, I do believe in the time of crisis, the only one that can protect you with respect to the publics are non-professionals. Journalists, even activists, who if they're going to be interested properly, they'll know more about your work and what you can do and what you cannot do than basically the normal public. And I do believe that this is a dilemma which is going to be solved by each probably national professional community on its own. But at the moment when the public is angry, and to be honest, angry at everybody, the ones who are going to be the most defensive and secret probably are going to be the ultimate victim, because nevertheless that everybody hates the politicians are who decides who are the victims.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to come in next? We just tackled one of the three, so there's still two to go at.
Well, I'm going to tackle the technology, and then I'm going to come back to also some of the politics, if I may.
Oh, carry on.
I had a career that started in the world of design and technology for over 40 years in the world of information technology. So I know a bit of stuff about it. And the one thing that I have seen happen over those 4 decades is how technology can actually, although it connects us in many ways, can also be very isolating of individuals in the office, and removing of people as they sit behind. If you walk into any office today, you just see people doing email. Everything looks the same. Every office does. I know your emails are mounting up as you sit in here right now, and that's what you're going to go back and do at some point. Some of you might be doing them right now. But the point is,
if you can get reception,
is that when it comes to the ethical side, where we learned from our peer groups, we did it through observation. We watched, we learned and saw what other people had done. As we move one step removed, because technology can remove us from it, then it is a very, very real risk that we start moving into a model where others are not able to learn anymore from observing the strongest and the most ethical behavior in the office, because it's just not visible. The other aspect is that technology itself tends to lead us to a very systemic response to systems issues, which means that we reach for the process re-engineering thing as fast as we can, and those processes often can be dehumanizing. So I would put this as something which we have to be on our guard, and urge you to do that. The second question about political interference, I think, comes back to something which I think is right at the heart of, again, coming back, and I want to leave this on a much more optimistic note, my kind of final remarks here as well, which are...
We'll have those in a little while.
Oh, little while. Well,
yes.
Okay, but one thing. For goodness sake, as a profession, you can be the leaders, not being led. When we started this thing talking about making history or made by history, the world is crying out for a bit more stuff. I don't mean things, I mean a bit more stuff about the environment and society, and the things that are very interesting to us. And I think for you to take a position where you can start leading, not waiting for the regulator to regulate, but creating the standards that organizations should comply with in those domains, is something very important. And that then gives you the power and an opportunity to become leaders yourselves. And that's, I think, an opportunity not to be wasted.
Very good.
I'd like to build on that, but also perhaps give a slight counterpoint to that in terms of technology. I confess I've been doing my email and tweeting, and I sent my teenage daughter a picture of all of you and various other things whilst I've been here, so we all do a bit of that. Please don't tell, no disrespect intended. But
we're just in awe of how you've been doing that.
Really?
Yes, absolutely. I've been sat next to you and I haven't seen you doing that. Very good. You've got a psychic computer, have you?
Some people saw me doing it earlier.
Right.
But the thing is, everything Nick has said about the last generation of technology is true. The last generation of technology was sort of dehumanizing to a large extent, and it disconnected us. Now, there are some really hopeful signs in social technology that have yet to be adopted by any of the major accountancy firms in the UK, although there are people in those firms who've been trying and trying and trying for a decade to do that. So I'll give you a couple of examples. One, yes, we need to return to this sort of apprenticeship, mentoring sort of relationship. Social technology is brilliant for that. Next week, I think, is Working Out Loud Week, Working out loud means you just essentially narrate the work you are doing using social channels to your colleagues so that they can learn about you, they can develop this sort of ambient intimacy with you, so they can sort of know you without even physically being next to you. So it could be colleagues in other jurisdictions or other countries or whatever. That notion of ambient intimacy through social technology is actually very powerful. It's a very powerful learning tool, and it's one that, if used properly in companies, could rehumanize the work, could bring us back to a situation of mentoring, reverse mentoring, apprenticeships, and this sort of learning, this human learning relationship that we need to have. Plus, it's a great way of transmitting sort of moral and ethical standards as well, because you're not all having a lonely relationship with a point in the hierarchy and just reporting upwards, through successive sort of levels of dehumanized relationships. You're actually, working more like, a squad in the army. In other words, you're working with your peers. Everybody knows what's going on, and you're developing values and working well together. So actually, I've been a huge proponent of the potential of social technology in the workplace to create more human-scale relationships, and also to get us to know each other better, to create opportunities for social interaction, for coffees, for lunches, for meetings, that we might not otherwise have had. So I think there's a lot to be said for that, to your point in the audience.
Very good. We've all picked up a new phrase, ambient intimacy, although I have to say we still haven't found out from this side anything about past girlfriends or party habits, so there's something somewhere still to go. The two guys here, I've got to just say that there's a few people kind of leaving. It's like at the end of a football match when everyone's kind of decided that we've won, so we'll just leave. We will finish at 5:30, so everyone just put a ban on exiting, because it's really discouraging here to just find, as you're speaking, that somebody's walking out. So, Brett and Ivan, final thoughts.
And I already did my final.
Did you?
Oh. Sure.
Very good. Brett, you've got more time for your final thoughts.
I don't really have anything that profound to add to those questions. I mean, I guess the one thing, and we can't, in a forum like this, it's too deep an issue to discuss in any depth, but one thing I'd say is, if you actually want to lead on stuff, don't ever take the predominant narratives that are pumped out by various industries. I noticed three big narratives that we have here. That technology is there's this whole like tech narrative always at the time, pumped up by Silicon Valley in particular. That somehow, and people sort of feel on the back foot, like, I watch KPMG's videos, and it's like, we have to show that we're really into tech right now, even though we're not actually tech people. I mean, you should just cut through that and don't take Silicon Valley's narrative for a start. The second narrative is the whole globalization one. This has been pumped out for ages, globalization, and globalization and tech always go together as well. Use tech to globalize. I mean, the globalization narrative is not at all straightforward. There's huge amounts of localization stuff going on amidst this. I mean, so cut through that narrative as well if you want to be on the cutting edge. Then the other one that comes through is this imagined distinction between the state and the market. And this is something that's breaking down day by day. This whole old notion that somehow you have, the regulators versus the market. This is going to be, I think, in probably 20 years' time, seen as an incredibly archaic, old school view. And actually, people are starting to realize there's a lot of different political dynamics. And the whole idea that politics entails being a politician is breaking down. There's politics in every act of business. So the idea that you somehow escape politics by not having politicians is absurd. And actually you find that all these things interacting. The tech community believes it can escape politics by just putting lots of technology out. But technology has huge amounts of political dynamics built into it. It's just that they're not explicit. So I guess my basic point is that if you want to try and, redefine the audit profession and so on, is you take the lead in these things and don't take other people's bullshit, as it were, about this stuff.
But is there anything you feel passionately about?
That's a positive vision.
It's wonderful. And
I do believe not taking a bullshit is a good ending.
Yeah. So we'll now go into the closing sequence here, where you signalled you'd already given your closing comments, and
yeah.
I don't think Brett could top that with me now saying, would you like to make some closing comments? I think we had a map here of some horizons that we wanted to cover, and we've covered them all. I'll just give you a few slogans, if you like, to take away. Make history, take responsibility, question transparency, empower all groups, empathize with people, create experiences, build networks, act locally, and claim the public interest. And then finally, don't take bullshit, which...
That's actually not on the paper. He just said that.
I just made that up. So I think that's quite a good agenda, and I particularly like the idea that actually we've generated some issues which are really emerged from a professional community talking rather than the way Brett took it. Let's just take these, so-called mega trends, and we've all got to kind of think how we react to those mega trends. My final observation to give us confidence to do that is actually the accountancy profession has a phenomenal engagement with society and businesses and things that happen on the ground. We're kind of embedded in what happens. So it's very peculiar if we kind of say, so in thinking about the future, let's ask somebody else to kind of come in and tell us what we need to know. And I think what we've heard from the panel here is actually an appeal to all of us to actually go with what we actually already know. They haven't, in a way, come to us as a designer and engineer and organizational strategist and a political scientist and a journalist activist and said, I've got some things to tell you. I think they've really been saying, you're all actually engineers and designers, you're all organizational strategists, you're all political scientists, you're all activists and journalists, you've got these values, so just give expression to them. So maybe it takes these outside perspectives to say that we have a lot of these things within the profession, and maybe we should just have a little bit more courage about taking them forward. So on that note, promising that we'd finish at 5:30, at least it's 5:30 by my watch, it's time for you all to just applaud whoever you'd like to applaud. You could applaud any of these guys up here, you could applaud me, or you could applaud all of you for staying, asking great questions, and keep going.